Okay, I think everything's working. So good afternoon, debaters. My name is Jake Swede. I am the program director at the Minnesota Urban Debate League. This is a series of videos where I'm just talking about some general debate concepts that I think are going to be super helpful for you in learning about debate and making sure you're debating the right way. So this is a video series primarily meant for middle school national topic debate. And it's going to be something that we use over several years. So this particular video is about sort of the foundational concept we're going to talk about, which is debate arguments as stories. And hopefully all these videos will be about 2 to 3 minutes long, excluding the videos that are about evidence, which are going to be a lot longer because there's a lot of evidence to talk about. So let's get into it. So what we're talking about today is thinking about debate arguments, about the arguments you're going to make in your debate as stories. So the things we're going to talk about today are what is a story, generally, what does that mean, how each argument tells its own story, and then we're going to talk about why thinking of an argument as a story is helpful, why it's going to be really important for you as we talk through these videos and as you look at the evidence and think about your arguments, things like that. So first, we're just going to talk about what is a story. So stories are a way to help organize and explain how things happen. So if someone asks you like, oh, what happened, when you were 9, or what happened at this event, or, basically they ask you anything about your life, you may not realize it, but you put most of those answers into some type of story, right? And you may not always have these 3 parts, but sometimes these parts are implied and sometimes you actually talk them out. So every story basically has 3 parts. It has a beginning, things were this way. Then it has a middle where things change, where they're no longer that way. And then it has an end where you say, all right, there's some sort of point to this story, and we get to the end and I reveal to you what the point is, right? So things start off a certain way, they change, then you get to a natural end because you've finished telling the story, you get to your point, right? So here's a really simple story. Not a very interesting story, but it's a simple story, right? So the story is, beginning, my cats were hungry this morning. They woke me up. They got me up early. Middle part of that story, what changes is, I get up, I give them some cat food. They eat it. They're super happy. They have a great time. And then the end of the story is they weren't hungry anymore, right? So this is a really simple story. It's not an interesting story. Your stories are going to be more complicated and way more interesting. But this is just an example to show a point, right? There's a beginning where there's a problem. My cats are hungry. There's a middle where something happens, I feed them, and then there's an end where the problem is resolved, we arrive at the end of the story. Okay, so how that relates to debate is that in debate, each argument you're going to use is going to have its own story. So for the plan, for disadvantage, counterplan, critique, at every level, from rookie up to varsity, there's a story that you're trying to tell the judge, right? And that story is, if the plan passes, if the affirmative passes their plan, if the judge votes affirmative, what's going to happen? Are good things going to happen? Are bad things going to happen? Where do we go from the beginning to passing the plan to the end? What's the outcome of that story, right? That story is for the benefit of the judge to help them make sense of the evidence and how the evidence and arguments relate to each other, right? So you could just stand up and read a bunch of facts and just expect that the judge figures it out or knows what you're talking about. But that's not a very good way of debating, right? Because the judge might not know very much, or they might not understand how all these things connect to each other. So you have to make it explicit, to tell a story to them and say, hey, here's how things are right now. If we pass the plan, things are going to change. When things change, it's either going to be a good thing if you're the affirmative, or a bad thing if you're the negative, right? And we're going to talk more in depth about this in the next video. So if you don't fully understand that right now, that's fine. We'll get to more of it later. So then that leaves the question, why think of debate arguments as a story? We could think of debate arguments in a lot of different ways. Why think of them as a story? So one thing is that stories help organize facts, arguments, data, logic into a way that makes sense. If we go back to this story, if I just told you, I have this certain brand of cat food, my cat's names are, Goblin and Coco, and they live in this place. Like, there's all this like data and logic and stuff and facts that don't necessarily make sense together. When you put it into a story form, it helps intuitively make a lot of sense about what we're talking about here. And if we took these three parts, beginning, middle, and end, and shifted them around so that like we start with the end and then we go to the beginning and middle, it wouldn't make as much sense, right? The data, the facts, everything would stay the same, but we would just be moving it around and make less sense, right? So stories help make things easy to follow, and they're intuitive, and they tend to be interesting. That story is not very interesting, but your stories will be more interesting. And stories are pretty easy to change and explain as the debate moves forward. So if you have an original story and then the negative team comes up and says, well, yeah, you do change the world, but you change in kind of a bad way in some respects, you can come back and change your story and say, okay, there might be some bad things that happen, but in general, it'll be good, or that bad thing isn't really that bad, or whatever, right? So it's a lot easier to change your story if you have a really clear, coherent story. And then the last thing is, as we go through the other videos, we're going to go back to this idea as arguments as stories, and it's going to help us think about different concepts, right? So we're going to think about like evidence, arguments, claims, how to talk to judges. Basically, everything is going to relate to this concept. So this video and the next video where we talk about how some different types of arguments actually tell a story in their structure are going to be super important. So I suggest you take some time now to think about how you can structure an argument as a story and why a story is a good way of thinking about what type of argument, and watch the next video. And then once you've watched those two, you and your coach or you and your peers, your fellow debaters can think about that a little bit more. And as we go to the next videos, hopefully it'll make a little more sense. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you feel like you got a lot out of this. And if you have any questions, I guess post them in the chat or in the comment section below and talk them through with your coach. Have fun.